Hello and welcome. This is our third lecture on Hobbes, and in this I shall try to present Hobbes in a very different and contemporary light. In the last two lectures, we have tried to outline how Hobbes was a modern political thinker, what entails modern political thinking, and the registers of the Hobbesian political thought in general. Now, what are the standard registers of the Hobbesian political thought? First is the state of nature, in which all men are fighting with all, right? So, in order to have security, in order to preserve themselves, they come to a contract. They establish a social contract by which they part with some of their rights and establish a sovereign authority. They establish a common power. This is the sovereign. Now, because the sovereign ensures security, removing the threat of violent death, what we owe to the sovereign is obligation. So Hobbes is also a thinker of political obligation. Now, Hobbes, while he speaks on emotions or passions, I've already told in my first two lectures how classical political thinking is engaged with a holistic viewpoint in general, which maps over all themes on earth nearly. So how to be a good citizen, what could be the virtues of a good citizen. From that, it really sort of touches and transforms themes of love and friendship, right? So apparently, modern political thinking is not supposed to be so overwhelming, so holistic. Rather, it tries to pin down political thinking in terms of those registers, standards, sovereignty, obligation, etc., etc. Now, in this lecture, I shall try to, highlight where Hobbes could strike a difference with the classical political thought. What does Hobbes has to say about love or friendship and how it is relevant to the Hobbesian political thought in general? Now, what is Hobbes thinking about the artificial person of the sovereign? Now, let us try to raise certain questions which could be, relevant. Now, the Hobbesian argument, as we had mentioned, was that in the state of nature, there were no rules, no laws. Everyone was his or her own master. Everyone was running after a particular scarce good, and everybody had all the rights, all equal rights to that same good. So there was conflict, there was violence, there was murder. To do away with this, social contract was established. Now, let us sort of raise some very relevant but very humble question. One is nature then a product of war? Hobbes would say no, because he was not taking it as a real fact, but it was a kind of, constructed thought experiment by which he could arrive at his conclusions. In fact, Hobbes was sometimes clear to say that, it was rather the kings, the sovereigns, the gladiators, and some men invested with the power to, exercise security of other people, pointing gun at other people. This gesture ensures, it sort of, initiates a state of war. So, for Hobbes, the state of nature is not a concrete fact, a scientific fact. Rather, it is a gesture, a posture, which could be appropriated or understood by the sign of a gun pointed out at somebody else. Hobbes also meant, in the state of nature, there was no notion of good or bad, justice or injustice. For these notions to come about, we had to have the civil state. Now the question is, if these notions were absent, then how could you have the social contract? Because if you say that against the backdrop of nature, you are, writing or sort of ensuing or starting or establishing a social contract, covenant or compact, then the state of nature is sufficient. And if you say, no, we had to have some kind of social rules in order to have that contract, then it is not the state of nature against which you are having that contract. The civil state has sort of already begun. So there is a definite contradiction in this kind of argument. What Hobbes is making, because there is a mix-up between the past and the present. To say that there is, a fight among everybody against everybody is also a misnomer, a tautology. Because there could be a fight between some against some, or a few against many. But to say everybody is war with everybody else is to, presuppose anarchy, which is not war. Now, in fact, Hobbes, as I told you in the first lecture, being a very astute philosopher, he obviously understood these objections, right? His answer was, now in a state of nature, to kill a person, to offer him a violent death, the gift of violent death, you don't need a lot of intelligence, a lot of brain, right? Rather, what you need to have is kind of a sheer stroke of luck. For instance, somebody is sleeping. You want to kill him. So you go and strike a rock on his head, right? Bash his head and kill him. This is a kind of the picture of killing, a murder picture portrayed by Hobbes. Now the point is, if there were, as Hobbes says, there were more cleverer, more intelligent people. Now how to kill those more intelligent or cleverer people? Now Hobbes says, for that, you had to conspire with some people who sympathize with your cause. Now, this is the hunch. Now, if you could conspire with some people, they are on your side. They might be called your friends. Now, the people you want to kill, they are on the other side, right? The moment they are on the other side, they are your enemies. Now, we have a group of friends militating against a group of people whom they see these people as their enemies. Now, if this happens, then this is not a war of everybody against everybody, but against a particular group, right? A war between a particular group and some other group, between friends and enemies. And this was pointed out very clearly and taken to an extreme by a German thinker who also has had disreputed and arguable Nazi political affiliation. His name is Carl Schmitt, and I just suggest that someday you will undertake a study of Carl Schmitt in order to understand Hobbes. After we have had the state of nature demystified, well, now we could, of course, insert a particular register which is very, very relevant, because this would inaugurate a new age in modern theory in the hands of Marx. Now the point is, after the contract has happened, there is a sovereign, a commonwealth, who will take charge of our security. We are now obligated, we are obedient, right? And he will look after our security. This is very fine. This will ensure our preservation. But the question is significant, because there is the disturbing question of property, which, sort of springs up here. Where is property? Was there property in nature? Hobbes is very significant because Hobbes is making a departure. Hobbes does, in fact, very genuinely and very sort of, appreciably, Hobbes argues that there's no private property in nature. After the contract has happened, in civil social state, you have private property. Now, obviously, during those times, in which Hobbes lived, there were serious objections to this kind of argument, because in those days, property used to be understood as natural, coming from natural law. Properties, there was no civil social property regulated by the sovereign. In fact, this would be picked up by Marx later, and he would revolutionize the whole political thought. But the remnant, in fact, the residue, the early residue of this thought could be located in Hobbes. Now, having said this, having demystified the state of nature, having unpacked the state of nature in which Hobbes is, found to have been sort of thriving, we could sort of, divert ourselves to some other registers that I've already mentioned, located and documented. In fact, those themes I've reserved for this lecture, the topic of emotions. Now, as I've told you, love or friendship is a significant theme or themes in classical political thought, starting from Aristotle. What does Hobbes has to say about it? And how, in this, he's different from ancient or medieval political thinkers? And how this could be relevant to, our own science and times. Now, Hobbes makes a very clear, a very sort of illuminating distinction between desire and love. He says, when you desire something, the object is not present. But in love, the object is present. Desire lets you move away from an object. But when you fall in love, as they say, you want to reduce distance. Now, love and desire in Hobbes are a matter of, diverse usages. You can use love in a particular sense. You can use desire in a particular sense. But there is a click here. There is a catch here. And there's a dispute here. Hobbes tries to harp a distance between him and Plato. You've heard of the Platonic, conception of love, which in Greek times used to call eros. Hobbes is actually departing and demystifying this eros in a very significant manner. Take, for instance, a simple example would be the Platonic or the Greek eros is a kind of love which has a kind of goodwill built into its optic, Eros is kind of united goodwill, a dispositional goodwill by which you sort of wish the welfare of somebody else, and in the process your own welfare is ensured, right? Now, Hobbes is absolutely gravitating against this kind of proposition. What Hobbes is trying to argue is interesting, and it will strike an immediate chord with you. Hobbes says, take for instance pity. You find a beggar, you pity him, and you want to give him some money. You see a blind man, you try to give him something money or help him cross the road. Hobbes is saying that in this, there is no charity. The erotics of charity in the ancient thought is absolutely irrelevant. There is no charity here. There is no goodwill. Apparently, it might seem that there is an element of goodwill here, but there is no goodwill here. The point is this, and Hobbes says, with a distinct emphasis on future, on the future. And please mark it, because I hope that in the future, in the near future, or in an extended future, you will undertake the study of future in Hobbes, because that's a very significant and original element on which not many studies are available. What does Hobbes say? Hobbes says that you are giving money to the beggar, anticipating your own, kind of befallen, own dread in future, own misery in future. That means I'm giving money to the blind or to the beggar because in future, in the very uncertain future, if I become a beggar, I will get money. If I become blind, I shall be helped. This kind of egoistic pity is what Hobbes is trying to point out when he is discussing passions or love. And his quotation, his own words are, we desire the good of others through pity or benevolence because we are distraught, we are moved by a kind of projected similar wretchedness in our own persons. In their own persons is actually Hobbes' words. So this kind of ethical egoism doesn't help Hobbes to portray eros or eroticism in a very, good, positive and appropriate light. Hobbes is rather a mechanistic. Hobbes is developing kind of mechanistic theory of love or the passions. When he discusses this, he wants to say that there is, of course, there are notions of pleasure and beauty and but why do you want to feel pleasure? Now here, we can connect the Hobbesian notion of erotics or passion with that of the state of nature. He says we want to feel pleasure to escape the feeling of death, the feeling of violent death, and we want to feel alive. Now, how do you want to sort of, feel alive? By being secured, by procuring things which we sort of want to gather, and by having the rightful right to gather those things. Now, you see, Hobbes is haunted again by this imagination of death or violent death, which used to pervade in nature, in the state of nature, as Hobbes or the standard interpreters of Hobbes have tried to, portray or to sort of put up in front of us. So, what Hobbes is doing, Hobbes is trying to limit love, sex, even friendship, though there is not much Hobbes has to say on this, to the realm of privacy. And this has been argued very well by theorists, that though I'm reserving my own comments whether Hobbes is really trying to, reserve sex, love in the realm of the private. But this is significant because, you see, in classical Greek or the ancient notions of erotics, love or friendship, we don't have a private theory, that love or sex should be had in the private. This is not the ancient political thinking. They won't endorse this, right? It would be a very kind of public activity, a public thinking. Love was a very, very much a public affair. So, why Hobbes is trying to argue this? Hobbes is trying to argue this because Hobbes tends to argue when he talks about the love of persons, that when we love a person, we singularly love and we want to be singularly be loved, right? We want to love one or we want to be loved as one. Now, this is a great dispute in political theory, in ancient and even medieval and modern political thinking. Because the question, this was a question which had haunted Aristotle. How do we then differentiate between friendship and love? We could differentiate by saying that you can have many friends, but you can have only one lover. Right? You cannot have many lovers because you cannot divide your own self in many parts. But Hobbes disagrees. Hobbes says love could be, diverted to n number of objects, and love could be divided into n number of portions or parts. So, in that sense, if somebody tries to argue that why can't we love many people at the same time rather than one? So, they will try to, institute Hobbes in their favor and say that Hobbes had in a sort of moment of, moment of lust, a theoretical lust, he had sanctioned that you could love many persons. But this would be a grave, courageous misreading of Hobbes, because Hobbes is trying to, argue that the classical notion of love as goodwill or erotics or charity, the point is when I make a gift, there is an implicit notion of love, oneness. And this oneness extended to, the whole city, whole polis. It's a kind of one universal mapping which will give us a good city. This was one of the strands of ancient political thought. Hobbes is actually departing from it. So Hobbes is not very trustful of the ancient register of, friendship or love becoming a public political category. And rather, as one theorist has argued, that he tries to limit it to the realm of the private and privacy. This will go against the Hobbesian notion of unity or integrity. And with this, we shall end. The point is, when Hobbes says the sovereign or the commonwealth, whatever, is an artificial person, he makes a distinction between a natural person like you and me, right, and an artificial person. A natural person will bear his own actions, right? But an artificial person, for instance, an actor in a theatre, he is, sort of performing a role and sort of narrating a script written by an author. Now, if this is so, then there is a problem here. The artificial person or the sovereign, one who represents us, becomes an actor. But the author is somebody who is a scriptwriter. No. Hobbes is trying to argue that the actor or the sovereign is the author by default. The moment we authorize the ruler, with our own sort of privileges and rights to give us security, in turn we shall give him obedience. He becomes an author, at the same time an actor. The consequence of this is seen today in all liberal democracies, in all presidential democracies, everywhere. And what is that? Look at our representatives in the parliament, in the assemblies, everywhere. They will make promises. They will win our votes, go there and arrange for themselves. They will not keep any promise in their fulfilled form in any form. They betray or they violate the contract, right? Those temporary contracts which we make. What happens to them? Nothing. The system survives, the system goes on. And after there is... So Hobbes, extending the Hobbesian argument and taking it to some theorists, the German theorists like Carl Schmitt, it will be something like this. That this happens because there is distinction, there is a separation, there is a division between the legislative, the executive and the judiciary. There are three elements here. One who makes laws, he cannot execute it. One who executes it, he cannot, keep a vigil or sort of very judiciously, decide on those actions. There is a division, a fraction of actions and arguments. What happens? Nobody is accountable to each other. What is needed? According to the Hobbesian argument, these have to be integrated. And this is what happened during the fascist or the communist regimes, right? In those theories, the personality of the state, there is one person. The artificial person is just one. The state is one sovereign, and everything is united in. If there is this unity, then only something, can happen. The reality and the fantasy somewhere will be integrated. So, but this unity and integrity, the call for integrity in Hobbes, well, it is available because Hobbes is very much an absolutist thinker, right? He is not a Democrat. Even despite those misreadings by contemporary thinkers and professors. So, but you see, why Hobbes is appealing to this kind of integrity, right? Where everything is united in one artificial person. Where the representer is the sovereign or the represented. This call for unity is betrayed when he's thinking about emotions and love. The erotics in the classical political thought is betrayed in Hobbes, is defied and decried, in fact, demarcated, delimited and abandoned by Hobbes in favor of the private realm or where actually he's not very hopeful or positive about friendship, or love or passions becoming a public political spectacle by which the political life could be organized in a very, very distinct manner. So the moment we get this, but despite this apparent, contradictions, you can understand now Hobbes is a very interesting, a very relevant and a very significant thinker who could be illuminating in trying to, highlight and trying to, sort of interpret our everyday living in a very sort of fractured, divided, but very heartful and grateful manner. Thank you.